You've been hearing us talk about imperial yeast for a while now, and that's because we absolutely love the stuff. With 200 billion cells in each pitch-right pouch, we rarely need to make starters these days. While originally based out of Portland, Oregon, imperial yeast has expanded to the East Coast, meaning even more people have access to their incredible lineup of yeast, including popular strains like A07 Flagship, A38 Juice, A09 Pub, and a Brewlosophy favorite, L17 Harvest. So good. Whether you brew at home or on the commercial scale, imperial yeast has what you need to make the best beer possible. You can check out all of their available strains and start your planning at imperialyeast.com. When beer is exposed to oxygen, stale off flavors are produced and shelf stability of the finished product is vastly reduced. Hence the reason brewers of quality beer go to great lengths to limit cold side oxidation. While the most common methods brewers use to reduce this risk involve displacing oxygen with carbon dioxide, CO2, at various points in the process, there are chemical options as well. You're listening to the Brewlosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and this week I'm joined by contributor Cade Jobe to discuss the use of potassium metabisulfite, also known as PMB, as a way to reduce cold side oxidation, particularly in pale lagers.
Yeah, PMB, or maybe in industry more often known as KMS, the K for potassium metabisulfite.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is something that's actually used very frequently by commercial brewers, and I think increasingly so by home brewers, because of just how easy it is. And I mean, it's something that I've started to add to every batch. And I mean, I think that was based on one of the experiments that we talked about in a prior podcast, which was using sodium metabisulfite in a hazy IPA. But it's super easy to use, and it makes a lot of sense for the preservative elements that it adds to beer, and especially light lager. So I'm excited to talk about this one and the reason why we wanted to do this experiment.
Yeah, considering how long I've been brewing, which is nearly 20 years at this point, I'm a relative newcomer to the whole idea that oxygen exposure can have detrimental effects. I know that sounds nuts. Prior to a few years ago, I trusted that cold side oxidation impacted beer, but based on my own anecdotal experiences, I thought it just took a long time and that the effects were barely noticeable. Such is certainly not the case today. I definitely take measures to keep my beer from being exposed to oxygen, though I have tended to stick with non-chemical methods. I do use sulfites, however, for pre-treating my water, and I look forward to chatting about the impact it has when added to beer at packaging. All right, if you like what we're up to and you want us to keep doing it, please consider becoming a patron of Brewlosophy. By committing to a small monthly pledge over at patreon.com/Brewlosophy, you'll receive rewards like access to unpublished recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invitation to a monthly live Q&A session with someone in the brewing world. Coming up later this month, January of 2022, is one of the coolest homebrewing influencers out there, Sarah Flora, who runs the Flora Brewing blog and YouTube channels, where she covers everything from product reviews to homebrew beer evaluations. Honestly, if you're unfamiliar with Flora Brewing, go check it out. She has an Instagram page. She has a YouTube channel. I'm sure you're going to love what you see. Sarah's going to be hanging out with patrons on Saturday, January 29th, 2022. So be sure to make your pledge of just $3 or more at patreon.com/Brewlosophy by Friday the 28th. All past sessions are stored on our private Facebook page, so patrons can go back and watch them whenever they like. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by rating and reviewing it at Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts, we'd really appreciate it. In fact, for those of you who prefer Spotify for podcasts, I was just informed they now allow ratings as well. Feedback is brought to you by Brewers Hardware, who offer brewers beautiful stainless gear from fittings, kettles, and fermenters to brew stands and incredibly well-built turnkey systems. Do yourself a favor and head over to brewershardware.com the next time you're in the market for brewing equipment. They are sure to have whatever it is you need, especially if it's stainless. And be sure to mention Brewlosophy at checkout to receive a free gift. Again, that's brewershardware.com. Listener Peter K. wrote in with some feedback after listening to episode 215, where we delved into the style of American wheat beer and talked about my attempt to brew one using short and shoddy methods. Peter said, there is a great quote attributed to jazz legend Charlie Parker. Quote, "Learn the changes, then forget them." As a musician, this quote means a lot to me and enough to break them and speaks to becoming proficient by following the rules until you are, quote, learned enough to break them tastefully. To break the rules that make sense to break and still end up with something listenable. I've never thought of using it to talk about brewing, but it also works there. Great episode.
I love that quote. I actually didn't know that about Charlie Parker, but man, yeah, that's a really, really, really fun quote. And I think that it really does apply, right? I mean, although I don't know that, you would describe yourself as so learned that you're comfortable breaking all of these things. Maybe you would, but, I mean, that is the whole point of the short and shoddy, right? And that's the jazz style, it was breaking all of these sort of traditions and all these rules. And you came up with this amazing form of music. And I'm not saying that short and shoddy is going to be the next great, BJCP style, but it is kind of cool to know that, beer wants to be beer, and then you can learn all these methods and controls, and then play with it, right? And then figure out which ones you want to keep and which ones you don't. And I think that's the really cool part about brewing.
Yeah, and in a similar way as jazz, I mean, when as these jazz musicians were breaking all these rules in the 1920s, boy, there was an uprising, right, of those who wanted to keep things mechanical and organized. And we see kind of the same thing, or at least we used to. I feel like more and more people are embracing this idea that you can do things differently and not make a crap batch of beer. Obviously, there are certain things that have to happen in order for beer to be made, but I do find it interesting. All of the timestamps, for example, that we've convinced ourselves are absolutely necessary for the process to occur properly. All of the successful short and shoddy batches I've brewed have certainly motivated me to question those supposed truths unapologetically. So we appreciate the feedback, Peter. If you have show feedback, you can send it to feedback@brewlosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. Listener and very good friend of Brewlosophy, Matt Clay, who we got to hang out with in Asheville a couple years ago. Cade, he lives near Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where the commercial brewery known as The Gathering Place resides. Knowing how much I love clean, pale lagers, Matt sent me a can of The Gathering Place's Italian pills they call Arrivederci Roma.
1 minute beer review with Justin and Tim.
Look at it, it's pretty, yeah.
This is a really good looking beer.
Yeah.
It's a golden amber.
Ooh, this one smells kind of like feet.
Yeah, it's like feet on a sunset at the beach. But this is a good looking beer. It almost reminds me of apple juice. Ooh, good characteristics.
That's good.
This is a good beer. Not dry.
Not bitter. And
so the opposite of dry. What is that? Moist. I'm gonna go out on a limb. I think this is must be like a Pilsner type of a beer.
I'm going with that too. And by the pool, drinking it one after another
with some fried risotto balls. I want some risotto balls, maybe some meatballs, a little Italian action would be good with that.
It's good. I do like this.
Yeah, this is a really good beer.
It has a funky smell though.
Yes, I'm not getting a whole lot of smell, but the smell that I'm getting is not aromatic.
Doesn't reflect the taste. The
taste
you're not
putting that in a cologne. No, yeah, if you smelled it versus tasted it, it's very different. This is super drinkable. Timmy, what do you think this is? I'm going to go Pilsner.
I think it's a Pilsner as well. It's good. It's the taste or the smell is kind of funky.
Yeah, I mean just good, clean characteristics about it.
Yeah, it's definitely good.
I'm going to give this a 7.623 Timmy J.
Dang.
Yeah, this score's high.
I'm right around the 8-ish myself.
Yeah, 8.
First off, this beer did not smell like feet. I have no clue where the guys got that from. I thought it smelled super bready with some hints of kind of darker toast and spicy floral hops, about what I would expect from a nice clean lager. It was darker than most Italian pills I've had before. It had kind of an amber hue. I guess I would define it as more copper-like, but it was beautiful. It was clear. And what really got me on this review was Justin saying that this beer would go well with Italian food. What the crap? Justin is definitely a foodie, if you can't tell, but come on, saying that an Italian pills, which he did not know was the style ahead of time, would pair well with Italian food, that was a pretty good call on his part.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible, right? Saying that he would pair it with risotto.
Risotto balls, fried risotto balls, I believe.
Yeah, risotto balls, that's exactly right. But the thing that got me was feet on a sunset at the beach. I have no idea what that smells like. My wife always laughs at me when I come up with some like totally random descriptor of beer, but that feet on a sunset at the beach, that's one of the reasons why I love the beer reviews, because how do you even come up with something like that? What is a foot at the sunset?
I think you have to be an idiot first, dude, and that's one of the things I love about Justin.
Right. I mean, I was just, man, I don't know. I mean, the only thing I could think, maybe there was some sulfur in it or something, and that's what they were smelling. Who knows? I mean, depending on what yeast was used, maybe something something like that made a foot type smell. But it sounds like even though it didn't smell as great to the guys, that it still tasted great, and it sounds like you liked it. So awesome. Again, Matt, another great beer. Good job.
Yeah, and if I'm going to take a stab in the dark here, I think what they were smelling was the somewhat unique combination of a little bit darker malt than they're used to in Pilsners, mixed with a slightly higher hopping regimen of likely, I'm assuming it was something like Satz or a Noble hop. And when both of those are amplified more than they're used to, yes, it can be an odd or unique, I guess, perceptible experience on the nose, if you will. To me, it smelled exactly like what you'd expect. I didn't get any sulfur. I just got nice, clean, crackery, bready, toasty malt with some hops in the background, and I loved drinking it. Thank you so much for sending it in, Matt, as well as everything else you sent in. If you'd like to have your beer or any other fermented beverage you like to have reviewed by Justin and Tim, you can email me, marshall@brewlosophy.com, and we will get you all set up. When we're back from this short break, our focus will be on the impact of dosing a pale lager with potassium metabisulfite at packaging. After a long brew day, the last thing I want to do is waste more time chilling wort. I've tried so many different options, and ultimately I settled on the super efficient immersion chillers made by Jaded Brewing. With the King Cobra and Hydra, I'm able to chill my entire batch of wort from boiling to just a few degrees above groundwater temperature in as little as 6 minutes. If an immersion chiller is right for your brewery, then do yourself a favor and check out all of the rad options Jaded Brewing has to offer at jadedbrewing.com, and be sure to let them know Brewlosophy sent you. Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to Xchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. Craftmaster Growlers takes traveling with and sharing beer to a new level. Made from heavy-duty stainless steel, Craftmaster Growlers are double-wall insulated and can keep beer cold for up to 8 hours. Unlike typical growlers, Craftmaster Growlers come with a swiveling tap and fully integrated CO2 regulator cap, allowing beer to stay fresh for 2 weeks or more. The square design takes up less space and will fit in most refrigerator doors, and every Craftmaster Growler comes with a 1-year warranty. There are 64 and 128-ounce versions available over at craftmastergrowlers.com. Up until a few years ago, my packaging process involved running a length of tubing from my fermenter to the bottom of an unsealed keg that was not previously purged, then opening the valve or starting the siphon and letting the beer gently fill the keg from the bottom up. After a series of experiments indicating this process was likely affecting the quality of my beer, I changed my ways, opting to use CO2 from a canister to push my beer from the fermenter into purged kegs. This, quote, mechanical approach to reducing cold side oxygen exposure has certainly seemed to work well for me, and I know a bunch of people are also doing it, but it's not the only way. There are actually chemicals that, when added to beer, reduce the risk of oxidation.
Yeah, exactly, and it's not just oxidation too, these chemicals can do a whole lot of other things, and we'll talk about that. But yeah, the one we're going to focus on today is sulfite, and specifically, the form of sulfite that we're talking about is potassium metabisulfite, and so that was the version of this experiment. And we'll dive in a little bit later how what's actually occurring and what happens. But like you said, one of the main benefits of using sulfites is as a chemical preservative. Okay, so antioxidation is a great part of preservative, but it also does other things. It stops those browning reactions. So like when beers turn purple because they've got oxygen inside, it'll reduce that. And it also is used, I think a lot of brewers are using it to get rid of chloramine in their tap water, right? So, I mean, as a water treatment, and, and even in high levels, like if you get up around like 200 parts per million, like in wine, it stops bacteria growth, and even can inhibit wild yeast growth. So, I mean, there's a whole bunch of uses, for sulfites, but again, using it as an antioxidant is what we're going to talk mostly about today, in beer, and really its preservative capacity. But, the other thing that I find funny about this is I think I first heard about metabisulfite in the form of sodium metabisulfite from a Brewlosophy article I think that Jake Houlihan did a couple years ago, and that was really that's how I approached it. But this sodium metabisulfite or potassium metabisulfite is really just a carrier for sulfur dioxide.
Right.
Sulfur dioxide is a gas, and that has been used for thousands of years to as a stabilizer. I mean, and when I say thousands of years, I mean it was in pitch, which was used to line Roman wine amphoras, and British people that were shipping beer all around the world would actually burn sulfur candles inside of barrels to get this sulfur dioxide gas. So it's kind of one of those things. It's interesting that we talk about it as a chemical preservative, because of the form that we're using, this potassium metabisulfite or sodium metabisulfite, but it's really just a vehicle for sulfur dioxide. I don't know. I find that interesting.
Yeah, so do I. And I'm glad you pointed out and used the term that it's a vehicle for sulfur dioxide, because that's the way that I was, and I'm with you, man. My understanding, my introduction even to sulfites as a form of preservatives for beer, at the very least, is very new. I mean, within the last 3 or 4 years, maybe. And like you, I think and I credit where it's due. I really credit the Lodo guys, the low dissolved oxygen brewing guys. It's kind of bringing this substance, this chemical to the mindset of normal brewers who may not be following all of the Lodo techniques, which I trust is making very particular types of beers for these guys. But it seems like without them talking about it as much as they did, we wouldn't have been introduced to it and using it for all the reasons we do. Now, you said something earlier that one of the more fascinating things to me about potassium metabisulfite, which is also called Campton. So if you have a little baggie of Campton tablets in your garage, you have potassium metabisulfite. I do believe that Campton can also refer to sodium metabisulfite. We are focusing particularly on the potassium version in this episode here, but they are very, very similar. So the fact is, this stuff almost seems like it's one of the most multi-purpose tools in the brewer's handbag, if you ask me. You can use it to treat your water, which is what I do. It knocks out chloramine and chlorine very effectively and very quickly. You can use it at various points if you are making a sour beer. I've talked to people who sour their wort and don't want to bring it to a boil, so they just add some Campton or some potassium metabisulfite to that wort before going on to ferment it again. You add more yeast. As long as you knock that sulfite out, you should be good. I mean, it's crazy stuff. And then you can use it apparently to preserve beer in the package and to reduce the risk of cold side oxidation. What a multi-purpose tool. I feel like, how have we gone so long without having some of this cheap stuff on hand at all times?
Well, it's really funny because, credit to the Lodo guys, but again, I mean, like going back to Roman times, right? I mean, really all we did was just change the form of something that we knew is a preservative, right? And sulfur dioxide, like I said, it's listed on the on the generally regarded as safe list for the FDA. It's listed as an approved chemical preservative for the European food safety standards. I can't can't remember the exact name of those, but it's been around for a long time. But it's this form, right? It's the form, and the form of the sulfur dioxide that we're talking about today is potassium metabisulfite. And like I said, I mentioned at the top of the show, I think we've done a previous episode talking about sodium metabisulfite, and again, that was my first introduction to it. But again, all we're doing again is just having this vehicle for sulfur dioxide. So really, the only difference between sodium metabisulfite and potassium metabisulfite is the sodium or the potassium, and all that is the cation. That's the positive ion that creates the salt, right? That makes it a solid that's easy to transport, that you don't have to worry about. It's shelf stable, all that sort of stuff. So I mean, really, that's the only difference between those two is that sodium or potassium cation.
Yeah, and my understanding is that the amount of sodium and or potassium that is in the metabisulfite is so minimal that it purportedly isn't going to be high enough to actually perceptibly impact your beer or wine. I mean, winemakers are known for using far more of this stuff than we're recommending, at least for packaging purposes. And they're saying that it's not coming through. I tend to trust that, but again, just to be clear, we are focusing on the potassium version in this episode. So, but that it shouldn't make much of a difference. Now, I do want to clarify a couple of things. First off, we are focusing on the use of potassium metabisulfite as a way to mitigate the risk of oxidation in the package. And so the idea here, very, very simply put, I'm sure, Cade, you will go deeper into this, is that once that PMB gets dissolved in the beer, a redox reaction occurs whereby those sulfite ions bind with oxygen in solution, and that's how they reduce the risk of oxidation. We are not talking about the way that it takes chlorine or chloramine out of beer. Perhaps that will be in another episode. The other thing I really want to make clear, and it is so common for people to mistake this, we are talking about sulfites, not sulfates. Sulfate is the stuff that you try to increase in your beer to improve the hoppy bitterness. It's gypsum is calcium sulfate. We are not talking about that. Sulfite and sulfite, similar but different, right, Cade?
Yeah, exactly. Sulfate is SO4, sulfite SO3. All right, that's so one different oxygen. And I think I've mentioned a bunch of times how just one atom or one element can really radically change the function of something, like CO2 versus CO, which is carbon monoxide, right? But yeah, it's that SO3. And bisulfite is just HSO3. And so you've got this. I'm trying to think about like how much I want to delve into the science on this, because I gave a presentation about metabisulfites recently to a pretty scientific audience, and I don't want to go that far into it. But I think what we can say is metabisulfite is the negative charge of the atom. Okay, so the potassium or the sodium, in this case the potassium, is just a positive charge, and then the metabisulfite is the negative charge. When those two things come together, they stick together. But in water can break that apart really easily, in fact. And so what happens is the potassium just sort of settles out into solution or reacts with other things and creates other salts that don't really have a flavor active component. But the metabisulfite can go along and react with a whole bunch of other things. And when I mean a whole bunch of other things, I mean it can react with hydroxyl radicals, it can react with carbonyls, it can react with polyphenols. There's a whole bunch of stuff that it does. And this is what sort of leads to that cascading reaction that we've talked about in the use of metabisulfites. It's a water treatment device. It's also an antioxidant. It kills bacteria. It can inhibit yeast growth, all these different things that it does. But the whole point, and this is sort of the nerdy sciencey aspect of it, is that sulfur molecule so sodium metabisulfite, again, the metabisulfite then reacts with water and also breaks down into sulfur dioxide. Again, sulfur dioxide is the thing that's going around doing all of the hard work.
Yeah.
But sulfur dioxide, that's SO2. Okay, SO2. And when you look at the sort of nerdy, the valence of sulfur, it has 4. The positive valence of sulfur is 4 when it's bound to 2 oxygen molecules. But sulfur likes to have 6. Okay, and so what it does is it picks up essentially other things to get to that stable valence number of 6, and it'll pick up hydroxyl radicals. Like I said, it'll bind to carbonyls. It creates, it stops alcohols from turning into aldehydes. So it stops, ethanol from turning into acetaldehyde. And it just does all these really cool things. So hopefully that wasn't too nerdy, but you can tell I get a little bit excited about this stuff.
You alone, Cade, can get excited about talking about the valence of certain chemicals here. No, I actually find it very fascinating myself. And again, and we talked about it earlier, it seems like this is such a multi-purpose tool, and you can use it at so many points in the process for very positive things. I do think it's prudent of us to talk about the fact that there are those who have ostensibly have sulfite sensitivities or who are allergic to sulfites. Now, in my reading, though, in order for sulfites to trigger an allergic or asthmatic reaction, it has to be pretty high. The amounts have to be pretty high. So yes, if you're opening a bag of PMB and it wafts up into your face, I'll start sneezing like crazy. I start wheezing. I'm not dead, obviously, but it's very obvious that it's going to trigger some reactions, respiratory reactions in people. I don't think the amount, if you look at the amounts that we use for the various points in the brewing process at the various points, it is minuscule. It's amazing to me that it even has an impact how little we use.
Yeah, exactly. We're only trying to get around 10 ppm, but before we jump into that your comment about the respiratory issues, it's really interesting. If you look back at the studies on this, on the respiratory issues of metabisulfite, it deals with the powder form of metabisulfite. Once it's in solution, it's hard to draw the same conclusion that that's what's actually causing respiratory issues. Like you said, breathing in a bag, like if you open up the bag and some powder pops into your face, it's the same thing with pepper, right? Pepper causes you to sneeze and cough, and things like that. Now, there are documented, allergies or asthma, like serious respiratory issues. And so I don't want to minimize that at all. But if you look again at those studies, what used to also happen is they used to use this on like grapes and fruits, like especially fruits that could oxidize or like turn wilt.
Yeah.
You can put this potassium metabisulfite or sodium metabisulfite as a powder on the outside of those fruits. And so that's where most of those respiratory issues came from. Now, again, I'm not trying to minimize that or act like I'm some sort of expert on the health of this. So if you have respiratory issues or allergies or asthma, please take care when using this. But I didn't want to leave that without sort of pointing that out if you look into the studies. But yeah, we're using really, really, really small amounts in brewing. And all that you need in terms of potassium metabisulfate is 10 ppm. That's 0.3 grams of potassium metabisulfate in 5 gallons or 19 liters of beer. That's a really tiny amount when you think about all of the good that this can do. It's amazing that you can get away with that. Now, wine is going to be upwards of 200 parts per million. Yeah. And I think, if you look at wines, most wine bottles will say that they have metabisulfate in them. Again, for the preservative impact, and that's also to kill off any bacteria or wild yeast that may have gotten in the wine or be left in the wine. So it really is amazing how little we have to use.
Yeah, and in wine, they are. I believe it's for all alcohol in certain states, at least, that if you use sulfites, you have to list that sulfites were used or are present. But I was reading I did some research before this episode because this is one of those topics that I'm just not anywhere near an expert on. And apparently, you add sulfites to a beer, whether that's in the form of PMB or SMB, to beer or to wine. And it does its work, but then it kind of gets out of the way. Like the actual measurable level of sulfites that are, when you add, for example, up to 10 ppm of sulfites, which again, 0.3 grams of PMB, you better have yourself a really, really accurate fine scale, which you can get on Amazon for like $10. That's what I use. first off, you're adding such a minuscule amount. It does its work. It does whatever conversions, again, things I don't understand. But then it kind of gets out of the way, right? I mean, where I've always used sulfites is in stabilizing cider prior to back sweetening it, and it works wonders. And I add way more than 0.3 grams to cider, but it gets out of the way. I cold crash. There's no further fermentation happening when I back sweeten. My ciders are clear. The stuff does its job, and it does it incredibly well, and I just think that's interesting. Now, one thing, again, just to kind of differentiate PMB and SMB, correct me if I'm wrong, Cade, but I believe potassium metabisulfite is about 17% stronger than SMB. Not enough, apparently, to really for anyone to have to like adjust the amounts that they're going to use. I think people just kind of view SMB and PMB, aka Campton, as being usable at that kind of 10 ppm or 0.3 grams per 5 gallon mark.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't know that, again, the active component of PMB, SMB is the metabisulfite. I think the only difference is the weight of potassium versus sodium, right? Potassium is a heavier molecule. It has a higher molecular weight. So, but again, I think most of the packages, again, using that 0.3 grams is going to get you a sufficient around 10 ppm of the metabisulfite. Again, that's what you're trying to do. The metabisulfite goes into the potassium metabisulfite goes into water, it disassociates into potassium and metabisulfite. Then the metabisulfite disassociates down into sulfur dioxide, and that sulfur dioxide is your scrubber. In terms of the strength of one, no, I mean, because they bind the same amount of metabisulfite. But on the other hand, because the actual weight of the molecule is going to be different, you're going to have a different concentration if you use exactly the same amount. So it may not get you exactly 10 ppm. You might be at like 8 or 11 or something. But that 10 ppm mark is important because that's the level that you have to label at. So you won't see many breweries say that they have sulfites in beer because most of them are using it at that less than 10 ppm level. Huh. And the reason for that, again, is like you said with cider, when you're using it in cider's a wine and you're using it for its antimicrobial capacity as well. All right. And so you're using it to kill off unwanted bacteria. And so likely using it at higher than 10 ppm, or at least most recipes would suggest that you need to be at 50 to 200 parts per million in order to have that sort of microbial action. But again, it's in terms of strength between the two, potassium metabisulfite versus sodium metabisulfite, sulfur dioxide is still the scrubber. And that's one thing I want people to take away from this episode is, again, it's just a vehicle for sulfur dioxide. And potassium metabisulfite, sodium metabisulfite, those are just two really common ones that we use in the brewing industry and in the wine industry. But there's a whole bunch of other ways that you can get sulfur dioxide into beer. There's a whole bunch of other compounds. I'm not going to list them right now because it would be silly. We don't use them, and you have easy access to Camden and sodium metabisulfite. But again, that that sulfur dioxide, that's the real workhorse that's doing all of the work.
So, all right, let's talk a little bit about cold side oxidation. Everybody is very aware of what happens when a hazy IPA is exposed to oxygen. It turns brown. It tastes like, to me, the way I describe it is lemon heads without the lemon part. It's that sickly, sweet ickiness. Some people describe oxidation flavors as being like wet cardboard. I've never eaten wet cardboard, so I don't know if that's true or not. But this is also something that is known to impact delicately, or delicate beers such as pale lager, your Helles, your Pilsners. And so it's one of the issues that I think the low oxygen brewing group really is focusing on, because they're tasting these beers saying, wow, these things are oxidized. I think for a lot of us, and I'm fully on this train here, it's possible that we're just tasting or we just enjoy the flavor of slightly oxidized pale lager. That's one of the arguments I've seen. That's entirely possible that that's the case. But the reality is we know oxidation happens. That is an objective fact. So in order to mitigate this oxidation occurring in a pale lager, we might use various means to get away from that, right? To mitigate the oxidation. What are some things you might expect from an oxidized pale lager, Cade, in your experience? What perceptibly speaking, what might you expect from a pale lager that's oxidized?
Well, yeah, I mean, we've talked about it a bunch of times, I think, but I get that honey flavor. That's sort of the first indication that there's a perceptible impact. It's that sticky honey aroma and flavor. I think you've called it hard candy, right? I think. But it's that sort of like sticky sweet flavor. That's sort of the first indication. And then, of course, there's color changes, right? I mean, if you look at that sodium metabisulfite article that I did, that had no oxygen controls. So that was unpurged kegs. One of them got sodium metabisulfite. The other one got nothing, just had the beer racked into the keg, totally open to the oxygen, or totally open to the atmosphere. And then after 2 days or 3 days, that one that didn't have the sodium metabisulfite was purple. I mean, it looked gross. And, so you have these browning reactions that will happen as well. And none of these things are desirable. You can also have like a loss of hop flavor. Hops, the hop flavor of the beer goes away relatively quickly. That can be a sign of oxidation. It doesn't taste as fresh. It's not as pop. It doesn't have as much pop from hops.
Yeah.
And this is where that sodium metabisulfite really comes in as something that can be very, very useful. If you want to get a little bit into the nerdy again too, there's this OH radical. It's called the hydroxyl radical, and it happens all the time in beer. It's in actually a lot of different solutions, and it's sort of always around. But it's a super highly reactive molecule that essentially like rips electrons away from other compounds, and that can result in a lot of the negative things that we're talking about. But oxidation is just is that redox reaction. Again, that's what we're talking about. Oxidation doesn't necessarily involve oxygen all the time. It can be those carbonyl compounds, even though that does, I guess, involve oxygen in a carbonyl. But at the aldehyde, the alcohol turning into an aldehyde, some of those other reactions. So it's not necessarily just related to oxygen. It's just like the change in the compound and the way that the compound becomes essentially from a flavorless or having a different flavor to a flavor that we don't like and becomes undesirable. So that's really what we're looking at when we're talking about cold side oxidation specifically.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to point out that there are those, again, this comes largely from the Lodo Low Oxygen Brewing Group, who genuinely believe, and I have no reason to question them, but they genuinely believe that oxidation occurs from the point of milling your grain. And so they take steps to reduce oxygen exposure from that point on. And more power to them. We are just focusing here on adjusting or trying to mitigate cold side oxidation. And that is, by cold side, we're talking about everything post fermentation or during fermentation and after. So that's the idea. Again, we're trying to avoid that darkening, which is really annoying to me because you work so hard to produce a really pale, nice yellow lager, and it gets a little bit darker than you're expecting. And to me, I can almost taste the beer by looking at the darker version of it. You can tell when it's been oxidized. And again, I get that in addition to kind of this odd sweetness, I get, this sounds weird, but I get kind of a sharper bitterness from perhaps the beta acids oxidizing or whatever it might be. It is a very unpleasant thing for me, particularly in hoppier beers. But also, you taste it in these pale lagers all the time. I've had many craft pale lagers that I felt like were picking up some oxidation, and it's just not a very pleasant thing. And so anything we can do to reduce that, there's this chemical option, which is really neat. You drop a little bit of PMB in there. Now, tell us a little bit about how you go about, if somebody out there wants to try using sulfites to mitigate the risk of oxidation in their packaged beer, how might we go about adding that to the beer?
Yeah, that's a good point. So packaged beer is super easy to add. And the easiest way that I do it is I just put it in the keg. I put it right in the keg whenever I'm about to rack over. So I'll dump it in the keg, the 0.3 grams. I'll seal up the keg, purge the keg, and then rack the beer on top of the sodium metabisulfite or potassium metabisulfite in this case. And it's super easy, right? I mean, how much easier is that? You're just putting it in the keg, and you don't even have to worry about, it turning your beer hazy or cloudy or any of that stuff. I mean, it just literally does its job, and preserves your beer. I mean, granted, what is 0.3 grams of anything going to do to a beer? I would sort of have to wonder about like changing any the other characteristics, but this does seem to have a really, really strong stabilizing effect. And I've noticed it across a whole range of styles, like you said, from light lagers all the way to hazy IPAs. I've noticed it having making a big difference, and super, super easy to use.
Yeah, and that's the thing, right? Is that you're using such small quantities. You can get a whole pound of this stuff. I was Googling earlier, $6 for a 1 pound bag at More Beer right now of potassium metabisulfite. And I've had mine for going on 3 years now, and I feel like I have barely used any. And I've used it for cider. I've used it for treating every bit of water that I brew with prior to mashing. This stuff is going to last me forever. And so to me, again, it's cheap enough to keep on hand at all times if you're into using stuff like this. I know that there's a group of people out there who cannot tolerate the idea of using anything outside of, water, malt, hops, and yeast. And that's okay. If you don't want to use this stuff, fine with me, but I like having it around. I'm all into the kind of sciencey tool bag stuff. So one of the things that you'll hear about when it comes to using sulfites, I believe both of us have probably experienced this on some level, Cade, is that it can lead to, it is sulfur dioxide. I mean, that is the, like you said, the workhorse of this stuff. And it can lead to slight, as we might describe it, eggy, or some people will say rotten egg aromas coming from the beer.
Yeah, this is something that I've never experienced personally. But again, this is why we wanted to do this experiment, right? It is a lot of people complain. Well, they claim two things. One, they claim that you can taste sulfur in the finished beer because it is releasing that sulfur dioxide. But I think that's just not entirely accurate understanding, because that sulfur dioxide then goes on and reacts with other things. Now, the sulfur may ultimately get released, but again, you're talking about a small amount. So I'm not sure that it's going to have that much of a flavor difference. The other thing people talk about is that cation. So sodium or potassium. Yeah. And a lot of people will say, sodium has this super low taste threshold because we're really used to tasting this as humans, and salt is, this nutrient that we need in our body. So we have a super low taste threshold. If there's any amount of sodium or any amount of potassium in there, it's going to result in a different flavor in the beer. And that's a whole reason why we wanted to do this experiment, not just this experiment, but the whole series of experiments that we've done looking at metabisulfites. So you have sort of that sulfur character that people claim comes from the use of sodium metabisulfite. I would argue that's more likely just coming from whatever yeast was in there, because yeast produces a lot of sulfur off gas, and way more than the potassium metabisulfite is going to do. That's
what I was going to say. Is it's funny because a lot of the times that people are using sulfites in beer, they're using it to preserve that really nice grainy flavor you get from pale lager. Well, which also happen to be fermented, typically with traditional lager strains, which also happen to be known to produce higher amounts of sulfur. So if you happen to get a sulfury smell in your beer, it's one of the easiest fixes in my experience. All you do, I should say that if it's in a keg, it's easy to fix. All you do is you turn off your gas, purge the keg, and then put some more gas on it, give it a little swirl, give your keg a little swirl, let it sit for a couple hours, purge it again until that sulfur smell is gone, and you are good. You are not oxidizing the beer because it's only in contact with CO2. So it's easy to scrub sulfur out of beer. So that's not something that I would let hold me back from using this stuff if I have a use for it in my brewery. Well, like many other brewers out there, I've been using sulfites to pre-treat my brewing water for the last couple years, and it does a fantastic job of knocking out chlorine, but I have personally never used it for the purposes of reducing the risk of cold side oxidation. Cade, you were curious of the impact dosing a pale lager with PMB at packaging would have, and you put it to the test. Results when we're back from this break.
Compact and simple to use with a small footprint for brewing indoors, the Grainfather makes it easy for you to brew professional quality beers at home. The Grainfather is an all-in-one brewing system that lets you brew all grain beer in a single compact stainless steel unit. It uses an electric heating element and pump to maintain a constant temperature and to circulate the wort during the mashing and cooling stages. It also comes with a counterflow chiller to reduce chilling times and produce high quality wort. And now, with the addition of their conical fermenter, the Grainfather takes things one step further by offering homebrewers state-of-the-art temperature-controlled fermentation just like commercial breweries use. And with the Grainfather Recipe Creator and Connect app, you can easily design a recipe, sync your brewing system with your phone, and then just sit back and relax as the app takes over and assures that you maintain your scheduled mash temps and boil schedule. Head to grainfather.com to purchase your all-in-one brewing system today and to sign up for their free recipe creator tool. Once more, head on over to grainfather.com, that's grainfather.com, and get started today.
Family-owned Atlantic Brew Supply is the largest homebrew shop in the Southeast. No gimmicks, no multinational corporate overlords, and no BS. They offer exclusive malts, yeast, and more from local artisans, as well as award-winning recipe kits. They also sell professional brewing gear and cask equipment from sister companies ABS Commercial and Cask Supply. Most ingredients are available by the ounce, plus Atlantic Brew Supply has an on-site calculator to help you craft your best brew. Orders are processed same day, and 2-day shipping is guaranteed for East Coast customers. Get 15% off your first order using promo code BREWPOD, that's BRUPOD, at AtlanticBrewSupply.com. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. The brew-in-a-bag method has blown up over the last few years, and in that time, it's become very clear that not all bags are created equal. For the best BIAV experience, you have got to go with the Brew Bag. Made from high-quality, food-safe polyester, the Brew Bag is available in both 210 micron for standard brew-in-a-bag, as well as 400 micron, which works beautifully for all-in-one recirculating systems. I've been a Brew Bag user for years and wouldn't brew without it. Head over to brewinabag.com to get the fabric filter that works for you and use promo code TBP17 at checkout to receive a discount. Again, that's brewinabag.com. One of the many wonderful things about science is that in certain situations, it allows us to speak with some level of objectivity. And when it comes to potassium metabisulfite, we know that it reduces oxidative reactions. We just know that. Hence the reason it's so widely used in the food and beverage industries. But what impact does it have when added to a pale lager at packaging? That's what you aim to find out, Cade.
Yeah, and it's really cool, too, to think about like the backstory of this experiment. So one of the reasons why we wanted to do this one specifically with potassium metabisulfite is, again, people talking about that they can taste the difference in like, oh, the sodium aspect or the aspect that potassium adds to the beer, right? And so that's what we wanted to look at. We did an experiment with sodium metabisulfite. We did another one with potassium metabisulfite. And then even more recently with Andy, he just published one a couple months back, or maybe just a month ago, looking at sodium metabisulfite versus potassium metabisulfite at the same time. So this is a whole series of metabisulfite flavor experiments, and it was really cool to design. But yeah, so this one was potassium metabisulfite in a pale lager. And again, we wanted to start there because if that potassium is going to have a flavor impact, let's get everything else out of the way, right? We know it has antioxidant components, but let's get all the other flavors out of the way and see if we can just taste the potassium. So yeah, I did a single 10-gallon batch on this one, a pale lager. The grist was pretty standard, 79% pale malt, 18% flaked maize, and then 3% dextrose, just corn sugar. So nice pale lager grist. Mashed them at 145 Fahrenheit or 63 Celsius for 60 minutes. And when the mash was complete, I sparged and then boiled for 60 minutes. And in this one, the only hop I used was Tettnang, just added a bit just to get a touch of bitterness, right? So I did Tettnang at 60 minutes to hit about 8 IBUs, which for this 10-gallon batch was 28 grams or 1 ounce of Tettnang at 60 minutes. So then when the boil was complete, I chilled down the worts, took a hydrometer reading, and it showed that it hit the target gravity of 1046, which I think is a pretty good pale lager gravity.
Yeah, for like a nice American light lager, American, even premium lager, 1046, that's what I'm looking at.
Yeah, exactly. So so OG 1046, then I racked all of it into a single vessel. So again, this is going to be testing potassium metabisulfite at packaging. So everything is a single batch racked into a single 14-gallon brew bucket, and then I pitched 2 pouches of Imperial Yeast L17 Harvest into each batch, which again, I love that yeast if you haven't heard me say it 100 times already. Then I put the worts in chambers and did a warm ferment on these, so 68 Fahrenheit, 20 Celsius, and let it sit for about 11 days. And then after that time, hydrometer measurements were showing that the beer had reached the FG of 1005, so pretty dry, which was really nice and what I wanted in this beer. All right, so then this is where we introduce the variable. So the beer's finished, and at this point, so like I said in the prior segment, the way that I add metabisulfite to my kegs is I just measure out my 0.3 grams of potassium metabisulfite and then add that into the bottom of the keg, then seal up the keg and purge the keg. So the sodium, potassium metabisulfite's just sitting in the bottom of the keg while the CO2 is purging all the air out. Then I'll add in and rack over my beers. So purge the keg first, and then, add the potassium metabisulfite first, then purge the keg, then add the beer. Now, again, all I'm doing is 10 parts per million of sulfite, so not even very much, 0.3 grams. But we talked about that in the first segment, right, Marshall?
Yeah. And you don't need much of this at all. And I do want to focus real quick on the decision to purge both kegs. Now, we got plenty of comments on this when we published the article. There's going to be the perspective of why the hell did you purge both kegs when you were looking at the impact PMB has on oxidation. A part of the reason for this experiment, and I get that people might think that this is petty, we wanted to see if the potassium metabisulfite contributed its own characteristic or a flavor. Maybe it's more sulfur. Maybe the potassium has an impact. When both kegs are ostensibly not exposed to oxidation. Now, we know that PMB at packaging is used to mitigate oxidation, but there was a decision made here to see if that PMB has an impact, a perceptible impact on its own when it's not mitigating. Well, I mean, it's going to do its thing. There's always going to be some level of dissolved oxygen in beer, so it likely had an impact. And it was we were interested. Are we able to further the mitigation properties of oxygen mitigation properties of PMB, even though both beers are racked to purged kegs?
Yeah, exactly. Again, we're trying to get, does the PMB itself result in some sort of flavor, right? Does the potassium result in a flavor, or does the PMB itself, like you said, for sulfur? And it bears repeating. So we did the same set of experiments for the sodium metabisulfite. So started whenever we did sodium metabisulfite, when Jake first did that, he did it in purged kegs, right? And that was the first experiment. Then we did one where there were no oxygen controls, right? Where you just put it into unpurged kegs. Then we did like I said, I used potassium metabisulfite in an unpurged keg, or sodium metabisulfite in an unpurged keg with an IPA. So this, again, the natural extension of where we were doing this, ultimately getting to, does potassium or sodium metabisulfite result in a detectable flavor difference? So once I've got both of these in kegs, got them in my keezer, burst carbonated them overnight, and then reduced it to serving pressure. And I let this one sit for 4 weeks. I wanted to let this one sit to make sure if there was any oxygen in there that we were getting that reaction with the sulfur dioxide. So 4 weeks of conditioning these beers sat, and then served them to participants.
Yeah, so I like the idea that you let the beers lager for a bit, about a month. Now, I do want to say that you did collect data from participants, though I believe this article, you were collecting data for right around March of 2020, which, as we all know, was when the COVID lockdown started to kick into high gear there. And so you were only able to serve this to 16 participants before you had no access to participants. So now, before we get into the actual data, though, I'm curious what your experience was with these, being completely biased, having brewed the beers, knowing exactly what was in each glass. What was it like for you to evaluate these beers?
Yeah, I mean, I always do my standard test where I want to try to put the variable as far out of my mind as I can. So did 4 triangle tests myself and only chose it correctly just once. But admittedly, that was a guess. And this one was frustrating too, because this one I was just like, I mean, there's nothing. The beers tasted exactly the same. There was no difference in the 2 beers. And, after the triangle test, I then let the bias come like full-fledged in and try to taste like sulfur, or try to taste like, I mean, I don't know what potassium tastes like, but I guess like maybe banana or something like that.
That's what comes to my mind every time I think of potassium as well as banana. But we just know that again, banana is the vehicle for delivering that potassium to your body.
Exactly.
I would fully have expected, see, the way my brain works, and this, I am not a chemist by any means. So you already mitigated the oxygen in those kegs by purging the kegs before racking the beer in. And then in one of them, you added PMB. I would have at least expected that PMB, not having very much oxygen to react with, to have been, I know you're only adding 0.3 grams, which is basically nothing, but I would have expected maybe a little bit more sulfur smell or something like that. So the fact that you could not tell these beers apart, fully knowing what was going on, I think that's the first indicator that, maybe it really isn't. Maybe PMB doesn't have its own thing when added to beer,
Yeah, and like you said, we got some comments on this one, right? So people were saying like, "Hey, this is an antioxidant. You should rack it where there's no oxygen, where there's oxygen to react, and that'll cause the greatest impact." But that's not really how it's used. I mean, even if you're using it in commercial breweries, I mean, commercial breweries aren't exposing their beer to air so that they can add potassium metabisulfite to it, right? I mean, nobody's doing that. So it's also, and again, the whole point of this was I want to make sure that we're testing just the potassium metabisulfite. Does that result in a flavor character? So does the potassium itself, now, because remember, potassium metabisulfite will dissociate in water without reacting to anything, right? It's the sulfur dioxide that is the reactant, and that's why I always stress that so much in the prior episodes. Sulfur dioxide is the thing that reacts. Potassium metabisulfite just dissociates into potassium metabisulfite and then into sulfur dioxide.
Yeah, great points. So you served these beers to 16 participants in a triangle test, meaning 2 cups had the same exact beer, 1 cup had the different beer, and you asked them to pick the one that was different. Out of those 16, 9 people would have had to identify the unique sample in order for us to say with some confidence that there was a perceptible difference here. But in the end, how many people chose the wrong beer or the odd beer out?
Yeah, it was only 6, so 38% of them got the right beer.
Now remember, 33% is random guessing, and so 6 is almost about that point. 5 to 6 gets you in that 33%, or 1/3. You'd expect 1/3 of the people, if they're identical beers, to pick each color, and that's about what happened here. So we can say again that tasters, at least in this experiment, weren't able to reliably distinguish these beers. Now that doesn't mean that we can go and make the statement that potassium metabisulfite does not have an perceptible impact on beer. We actually know that sulfites do mitigate certain things. Well, if you add it to your brewing water, you're going to have less chlorine in the beer. If you add it to the beer at packaging, it's going to take care of some of the dissolved oxygen that's in that beer. In this case, when you are minding oxygen exposure at packaging already, and you add PMB at the rates that you would to mitigate oxygen, it doesn't seem to have a perceptible impact. I think that's pretty fascinating finding.
Yeah, I agree. And this one, this is probably the result that I expected, right? Seeing as how brewers have been using this for a while, especially commercial brewers, the KMS, the potassium metabisulfite, PMB, however you want to moniker it or, acronym it. But brewers have been using this for a long time. The Lodo folks are using it, and it's not resulting in, perceptible differences in their lagers, in their low oxygen brewing practices. And then you've got the historical use of sulfur dioxide, which is used as a preservative, and also the other use in foods. And so there's a reason why this is used as a preservative, is because it doesn't impact the flavor, I guess we should say negatively, because it does produce, like we said, oxidative changes. It does stop carbonyls. It stops browning reactions, all those other nice positive things.
Yeah.
And so that's all I can say in this experiment, since the beers looked identical too. There was no difference in like color or anything. That actually gave me some confidence that my closed transfer practices are actually, doing pretty well in terms of keeping oxygen out of the beer. But hey, a little bit of additional insurance, 0.3 grams of insurance is certainly not something I'm going to worry about.
Well, yeah, and to me, I trust that your pressure transferring process is very, very low oxygen anyways. When you're using CO2 to force beer out of a fermenter into a keg that you've purged, there's very little chance of oxygen exposure there. I get that. But it also, these findings give me confidence that if you're using PMB for purposes of oxidation reduction, which in this case, you're kind of not doing that because you did purge both kegs, you're likely only getting the good without contributing any perceptible characteristics. Anything perceptible that you're getting based on our understanding of how sulfites work in beer are likely positive, because you're going to increase that shelf stability. You're going to reduce the ickiness that comes from oxidation on the cold side. That's all good stuff to me. If you don't want to use sulfites, we are not pushing it on anybody. We do I think, collectively at Brewlosophy, view it as a really positive. And we thank the people who introduce this stuff to us because I use it all the time. Now, I have not used it on the cold side. I do have a little bit of anecdote though. I went years with packaging beer the way that I described earlier, not purging kegs, keeping the lid open on my keg when I'm racking stuff into there, not even forcing the beer out of my fermentation vessel with CO2, just letting air come in and kind of mingle on the top of the surface of the beer. And I had beers that did well in competition that I thought tasted good. But since I've started minding, the cold side oxidation stuff, I have noticed that I think my beers are better. And so I don't know if that's because we've just become accustomed to slight oxidation in lagers or any style of beer. But I will say it's been my experience that the paler the beer, the simpler the beer and the less hoppy that beer, the less likely it is the slower it seems oxygen exposure ruins that beer. Whereas the hoppier a beer, I've had even clear West Coast American style IPA turn purple on me because of vectors of oxidation in the process, and it happens very, very quickly in those styles. So I can't speak to why the paler lagers and blonde ales and stuff like that seem to not be as sensitive to oxygen as these hoppier beers. I know that there's some theories out there having to do with manganese and different other types of compounds that hops bring along or that certain types of grains bring along to the show. But yeah, I think it's interesting nonetheless, and I'm glad to have this resource available to us.
Yeah, exactly. Haven't you recently started using metabisulfite when kegging? Like really recently, like within the last couple months?
No, what you're thinking is I've been using it to adjust my water ahead of time. I've been doing that for a lot longer than a couple of months, but I've been posting pictures to the group about me doing it or asking. I always forget how much we're supposed to use to pre-treat water. So like every brew day for the last 2 years, I'm like, hey, Jake, how much do you pre-treat water with? But I've never actually used it in the keg, but I can see if I'm, let's say I cold crash and I forget to put CO2 on the fermentation vessel and I cold crash and it sucks some air in, I would be inclined to drop some, sulfites in the keg to hopefully mitigate that oxygen exposure from doing any further bad that it might do in that beer.
Yeah, and that's actually a good point too. We didn't mention this in the prior segment, but a lot of times brewers will mix it with ascorbic acid. They'll mix their potassium metabisulfite with ascorbic acid, and those two things create this really potent antioxidant mix. And so we haven't done any experiments on ascorbic acid. It's certainly on the list, but that does bear mentioning as well. Mixing those two things resulting in a better flavor stability for beer.
Yeah, absolutely. Now we did get a lot of comments on this experiment. I think a good majority of them had to do with, you purge the kegs. This is an oxidation experiment. Well, it sort of was, but it was really more of a PMB experiment. So we're going to leave those ones out. First comment does come from a person who goes by Runnin' Jim, who said, can you use gelatin and potassium metabisulfite in the same beer, or should the beer be cleared and then the PMB added later?
I honestly don't know, but my suspicion is it's totally fine to use both. So normally I use gelatin in the fermenter. So I'll usually add gelatin to the fermenter and then let it sit there. I won't add gelatin to the keg like some people do. Some people do that, and that's totally acceptable. I've never combined the two together, but I would think you could use them at the same time. Now, the only issue there I would worry about is that the gelatin is going to be in a water solution. So I don't know if the PMB, when it dissociates in water, is going to also bind with the gelatin and then cause issues with fining or any of that stuff. So I really don't have a good answer for that. I wish I did. But again, that's not what my typical process has been.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. As far as dosing a finished beer for the purposes of oxygen mitigation, you're likely going to find with gelatin first if you follow what Cade and I do, which is we add gelatin fining to the fermenter and then, after cold crashing, and then we rack to a keg because we want to leave that gelatin sludge behind. I don't want that in my keg. I think we addressed a feedback recently from somebody who it sounds like probably finds with gelatin in the keg, and then you're pulling all kinds of cruddy stuff up through your lines. It can get stuck there. I just want to avoid that altogether. So in that case, fine with gelatin, put it in your keg, and then that's where you can add your PMB, and you're going to be fine. Now, I will say when making cider, I use sulfites for a completely different purpose. I do add it to the fermentation vessel to knock the yeast out so that I can then back sweeten in the keg. And I like to rack the sulfited cider into the keg with the sweetener in there. And so I obviously have to add the SMB or PMB to the fermentation vessel. Now I have multiple times find ciders that I've treated this way with gelatin as well. Usually I will fine with gelatin first, let it sit for 24 hours or so, and then I'll come back and I'll add my sulfite and sorbate to the cider and let that go. And I have never had an issue with clarity or with the sulfite not working, meaning that the yeast has never kicked back up when I've tossed the cider into the keg. So that's my anecdotal experience. I will say this as a little bit more anecdote proving that sulfite works. There was one time where somebody had suggested to me, well, yeast doesn't work below 50 degrees Fahrenheit or 10 degrees C anyways. So if you're cold crashing in the fermentation vessel, you don't need to add the sulfites. Just rack it to your keg cold, put it in the fridge, and it won't kick back up fermentation when you back sweeten. That's crap, by the way. I ended up having a very overcarbonated beer in the keg that never cleared up, and you could taste, that slight fermentation character. So I always sulfite when I'm back sweetening my cider, and I've used it with gelatin as well, and it didn't seem to have an impact. So next comment comes from Jim Fisher, who says, you use 0.3 grams, and the picture looks to be about the same as a whole Campden tablet. Would that be about correct? Jim, basically, yes. My understanding, Cade, correct me if I'm wrong, is that a single Campden tablet will impart approximately 10 ppm of sulfites to 5 gallons of beer. You look at the fact that they suggest using, I think, anywhere between 5 and 10 tablets for a batch of wine, which you want to get, again, upwards of 200 ppm in. So you just divide that down. They are designed. My understanding, again, I've never actually used Campden tablets. I always buy the loose powder, but that a single tablet will or should impart around 10 ppm of sulfites to 5 gallons of beer.
Yeah, I think if you look at the dosing instructions on Campden tablets, it'll say that like one tablet adds 50 ppm of sulfite per gallon. So one tablet is 50 ppm per gallon. So for 5 gallons, divide 50 by 5 and you get 10 ppm.
Yeah, exactly.
And so I think that's exactly where we came up with that dosing rate amount is to get, and actually, if I remember correctly, I think that's how I came up with 0.3 grams is measuring out a crushed up Campden tablet.
Yeah, that's what, because people have done it. You look over on the internet, a lot of people are like, yeah, it's right around that 0.3 grams per tablet, and that's what you use. So, all right, next comment, final comment comes from Steve Little, who says, I had a beer that was likely to be badly oxidized as a Venturi effect occurred during transfer when the seal of the inner piece of my auto siphon started letting air in. First off, this has happened to everybody who has ever used an auto siphon, I promise you. Steve says, I essentially bubbled a lot of air into my beer on transfer. The beer in question was a Sierra Nevada Pale Ale clone. I added a couple pinches of PMB as I had read about the ability for it to reduce O2 and potentially save the beer. I later measured that would have been and what that would have been and found it was about 0.6 grams, so double what we recommend for the 5-gallon batch. Well, the beer developed a very strong sulfur dioxide smell, not a very pleasant smell. He said it was very strong. I ended up having to bubble CO2 through the liquid post and then purging the pressure in the keg and repeating until it started to foam out of the pressure release valve, which is when I had to stop. I then repeated this bubbling of CO2 about 4 more times on different days. The rotten egg smell finally went away and the beer was now drinkable. One person who's tried it said it didn't taste oxidized. I find it tastes good now, probably lacking some hop aromatics, but it is an enjoyable beer now. Anyhow, it would be nice to see you redo this experiment on a beer that was obvious O2 pickup from a bad transfer.
Yeah, so I think there is an experiment where we did that with the SMB, not the PMB. I'm not sure if we've done it with potassium metabisulfite in a high oxygen environment, but we did do that with sodium metabisulfite, and that was the one where I was talking about in an IPA, and that one also resulted in I can't remember actually. If it resulted in noticeable differences in flavor and aroma, certainly in appearance. It did. And I don't recall anyone saying that it was a sulfur character if it did result in a flavor difference. I'd have to go back and look at my notes of that one and maybe get back to you. Get back to you on that. But that's surprising that you got such a strong sulfur dioxide character. I mean, that can happen.
I mean, Steve did say he used 0.6 grams instead of 0.3. I have definitely, even just in blending a little bit of PMB with water, I pick up and maybe it's just my head, but I pick up a sulfur dioxide smell immediately afterwards. Perhaps there was some in there. But again, it could have been the yeast, like you mentioned earlier, Cade. It could have been a function of something else. The nice thing is, all you have to do is purge the headspace of that keg a few times and it goes away, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, do exactly what you did. Just purge that headspace, and then the sulfur, comes out of solution pretty easily. And while Marshall was talking, I actually went back and looked at that the sodium metabisulfite in the IPA, and it turns out yes, it was significant. They had 34 tasters. We had 34 tasters in that one. 17 got it right, which was a P of 0.034. So they were able to tell a difference. But nine people preferred the beer with SMB, and 5 liked the beer package without SMB. And then 3 had no preference. So if you add up the ones that either didn't like or the one with SMB or had no preferences, 8 to 9. So I'm not sure that there was a huge difference that people were able to taste, between the beers, or at least preference between those two beers. But interesting that was also the case. I don't see anything in here about sulfur, but it's certainly, like you said, possible. It could also be because of the yeast. Maybe just still had some yeast in suspension, but like Marshall said, just purge the kegs and you'll get rid of that nasty smell.
Yeah, and use 0.3 grams instead of 0.6. I really think that the less you can get away with, the better in this case, and it really does seem that tiny amount does have a positive impact. So, well, that's all we've got on the impact of dosing a pale lager with PMB at packaging. Anything else you'd like to add before we hit the road, Cade?
No, it's just super easy to add sulfites. It's really easy to add it at packaging, and it really does wonders for your beer. So, as long as you don't have asthma or respiratory issues and you're not serving it to anybody that does, you consider using this and adding it to your brewing repertoire. I think you can have really, really good benefits from it.
Right on. Don't forget to subscribe to the Brew Lab podcast, where Cade takes you into the lab with real brewing experts to discuss the fascinating work they've done on our favorite beverage. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brewlosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brewlosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brewlosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brewlosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brewlosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it suits my bro. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman no more.